Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is Isaiah 60, the Magnetism of Millennial Zion, and we're continuing through the chapter. So let's look at verses 4 to 7, the wealth of nations. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together, they come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. The multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense and shall bring good news, the praises of Yahweh. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams/rulers of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall come up with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my beautiful house. All right, so we're continuing to talk about Zion. Zion is to lift up her eyes and see her sons and daughters come from afar. This is the remnant of Israel coming from the nations and returning to the land. Zion is like a bereaved mother who suddenly sees her children coming home after being away for a very, very long time. Isaiah 49:12, behold, these shall come from afar, and behold, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Syene. So there's lots of these mentions of the return of the remnant of Israel back to Zion. Isaiah 49:18 is another one. Lift up your eyes around and see, they all gather, they come to you. You can hear some kids in the background. They're just riding their bikes around the house, and we have guests. So, but we will ignore that and continue on. So, this is the good news. This is news that the remnant of Israel will indeed return to the land of Israel for the millennial kingdom. Isaiah 11:11-12. In that day, Yahweh will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So the remnant will come from almost every nation, maybe every nation, and they will regather in the land in Zion. And Zion's like a bereaved mother watching this happen. So Zion will exult as the wealth of Western nations comes to her. And I say Western nations here because they're coming on the sea. You see the abundance of the sea there in verse 5. So the remnant's going to be really excited when they see this wealth coming to her. They won't be able to contain themselves with joy. The sea is a reference to probably to the Phoenician trading centers that brought incredible wealth across the Mediterranean from the west. Remember, the Phoenicians were the first great Mediterranean sea traders. And so they're bringing this wealth and to the coast of Israel and then bringing it all the way up to Jerusalem. So millennial Zion, in other words, is going to be a very prosperous place economically. Isaiah 18:7 says, at that time, tribute will be brought to Yahweh and of hosts from a people tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of Yahweh of hosts. So that's earlier in Isaiah, and that's specifically talking about the Ethiopians from the south. Jeremiah 33:9 says, and this city shall be to me a name of joy, a praise and a glory before all the nations of the earth, who shall hear of all the good that I do for them. They shall fear and tremble because of all the good and all the prosperity I provide for it. So the great prosperity of Zion will be one indication to the nations that Zion is to be honored and feared, really. And that's the word that Jeremiah uses, Jeremiah 33:9. So look at verse 6. Here the southern nations are bringing things as well: wealth, gold, frankincense, and also good news. So the trade of India and East Africa in those days converged on Sheba, which is in modern day Yemen, and into the Red Sea. And then the goods were transported in caravans to the rest of the Middle East, and also to Phoenicia, where those goods would get on ships and go to the Mediterranean to the west. So Sheba was really at the center of some important trading routes. Now, in the ancient world, both the gold and the incense were extremely valuable. They say, or the commentaries say, that incense was just about as valuable as gold. So this is the nations aren't bringing their leftovers; they're bringing their best. They're bringing their great wealth to Zion. Presumably, the gold will be used to beautify the city and the temple in Jerusalem, and the incense will be used on the altar of incense that is described in Ezekiel. And again, this is going to be a functioning temple in the millennial period, the one Ezekiel 40-48 describes. And they're going to have an altar of incense. And so this incense that's brought will be used to worship God. So the gold will build the temple, and the incense will be used to worship in that temple. So notice, though, that it's gold and frankincense. Where's the myrrh, right? Well, unlike the wise men, the southern nations aren't going to bring any myrrh. And this is because Jesus will, at this time, have defeated death. And myrrh is used for burial. So we don't need that myrrh anymore because Jesus has defeated death. The wise men brought the myrrh because at that point in Jesus' story, in Jesus' history that was coming, he was still to die. But now we know from Romans 6:9, having been raised from the dead, he will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. And so we don't need that myrrh any longer. So it makes sense that they don't bring myrrh. In verse 7, sheep and goats from the eastern nations will be accepted on Yahweh's altar. So we're coming from still a third direction here. We came from the west, we've come from the south, and now we're coming from the east. And these flocks will be used also in the temple to worship God. So notice that all of these items are really useful to worship God. So the nations are participating in this worship by bringing these gifts. So, as 7 draws to a close, Yahweh will beautify his temple. Zion is going to be so beautiful. It will be the most beautiful place you can imagine. Isaiah 4:2, in that day, the branch of Yahweh shall be beautiful and glorious. Isaiah 28:5, in that day, Yahweh of hosts will be a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people. I can't wait to see this beautiful Zion in the kingdom. Now, although the church is, of course, a temple, the living temple, Isaiah here is talking about a literal temple in the Messianic kingdom. So don't confuse the living temple, the church, with this real, literal, physical temple in the millennial kingdom. This is real gold. This is real frankincense. These are real people and real nations that will in the future do these things. We're going to, again, read scripture in a literal, grammatical, historical way. So don't confuse the real temple in Jerusalem with the living temple, which is the church. Okay, your children from afar, Isaiah 60:8-9. Who are these that fly like a cloud and like doves to their windows? For the coastland shall wait in hope for me. The ships of Tarshish first, to bring your children from afar, their silver and gold with them, for the name of Yahweh your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has made you, Zion, beautiful. We see a lot of the same themes as the previous paragraph. The Western nations will bring the remnant of Israel from afar on ships, and they'll bring their gold and silver with them. The doves and the clouds and the doves here probably stand for the billowing sails of ships, of sailing vessels that looked like clouds in the distance. So that's probably what Isaiah is referring to here. So the nations will actually physically bring the remnant and transport the remnant and participate in that, bringing Israel back to the land. This is mentioned in several parts of Scripture. Isaiah 49:22 is one. Behold, I will lift up my hand to the nations and raise my signal to the peoples, and they, the nations, shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders. So the nations are going to participate in this great return. And the nations will also deliver a silver and gold along with the remnant. This is a common biblical theme. Recall that in Exodus, God promised that when Israel left Egypt, they wouldn't go out empty-handed, but that they were to ask the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry, for clothing, and they would plunder the Egyptians, and that's exactly what happened. So here it echoes back to the Exodus. Here we have the nations bringing Israel back to the land with gold and silver. Back then, it was the same thing. They were leaving Egypt and going into the land with gold and silver. This is the biblical pattern for when Israel returns to the land. Psalm 72:10 is along these lines. It says, may the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. So again, we see this constant theme in Scripture of a return to the land for the Jews, but not with not empty-handed, not with empty pockets, but rather with gold, silver, and other items of wealth to bring to the land and to get set up in their new life in the millennial kingdom. Why do the nations do this? It's because of Yahweh. It's because of the name of Yahweh, your God, and because of the Holy One of Israel. It's not because of anything intrinsic in Israel herself or Zion itself, but it's because of the God of Israel and the God of Zion. Isaiah 24:14-16, they lift up their voices, they sing for joy. Over the majesty of Yahweh, they shout from the west. Therefore, in the east, give glory to Yahweh. In the coastlands of the sea, give glory to the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. From the ends of the earth, we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. That's Isaiah 24:14-16. Notice the focus on God himself. That's what is attracting the nations. That's why the nations are doing these things, is because they see that God, the God of Israel, is the true and living God. Okay, verses 10-14. Again, we continue this theme of the city of Zion, the city of Yahweh. The sons of foreigners shall build up your walls, and their kings shall serve you. For in my wrath I struck you, but in my grace I have had mercy on you. Your gates shall be open continually. Day and night they shall not be shut. That people may bring to you the wealth of the nations with their kings led in procession. For the nations and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid waste. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the plane, and the pine, to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious. The sons of those who afflicted you shall come bending low to you, and all who despise you shall bow down at your feet. They shall call you the city of Yahweh, Yahweh, Zion of the Holy One of Israel, Zion, Kadosh, Israel. Wow. So lots happening here. Verse 10, the nations will build up Zion's walls and serve sharat, the remnant of Israel. So there's going to be lots of different reactions by the nations to Israel. There's going to be positive and voluntary actions, and there's going to be negative and involuntary actions. It's going to be hard to be neutral. I don't think being neutral is possible under these circumstances. So let's look at a couple of verses that show positivity of the nations to Israel. And that's going back to Isaiah 56, verses 3 and 6. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from his people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. Recall in that chapter how the foreigners and eunuchs loved the God of Israel so much, they wanted to be there in Zion, worshiping God with Israel. Verse 6 of that same chapter, and the foreigners who joined themselves to Yahweh to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Shabbat and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant. So this is positive and voluntary attraction to the God of Israel and worship. There's also going to be negative response, but nevertheless, they'll be forced to come to Israel or to Zion and serve the remnant of Israel. So this is Isaiah 14, 1-2. And sojourners will join and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob, and the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in Yahweh's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppressed them. So here it seems to be both positive and negative are being brought. And the negative, especially those who have negative a response to Israel, will be taken captive, and they will be possessed by the remnant as servants, and they will rule over those who oppress them. Isaiah 49:23, with their faces to the ground, this is talking about kings and queens, they shall bow down to you, the remnant, and lick the dust of your feet. So there will be a recognition of subservience by certain nations to Israel. So there seems to be a distinction between the nations who love Israel and the nations who hate Israel. And there's going to be some involuntary submission, and then there's going to be some voluntary joining in the worship of God by these nations. And what's cool is that Zion's and its surrounding cities are going to be rebuilt. Remember, this is after the chaotic destruction that happens during the 7-year tribulation. So it's going to be, a very desolate place, and there's just going to have to be this total new construction happening. Picture World War II, and then the Marshall Plan and how Europe was rebuilt. If the war in Ukraine ends soon, hopefully, then those cities like Mariupol will have to be rebuilt and start from scratch. And that seems to be what's going to happen in the millennial kingdom. Jesus isn't just going to snap his finger and wham, there's Zion restored. No, it's going to be a building project, and the nations are going to be the servants who build it for the remnant. That seems to be the indication here. Isaiah 44, verse 26, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins. Isaiah 58:12, and your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. And Isaiah 61:4, they shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. So remember what I said before, that millennial Zion is built by human hands with earthly materials, as opposed to the eternal Zion, which will be built by God himself with heavenly materials and coming down from the sky onto the earth. So we need to distinguish between Zion, millennial Zion, and eternal Zion. There will be a great reversal, obviously, in the relationship between Israel and the nations. In the past, nations came with their armies to destroy Jerusalem and take its gold. Nebuchadnezzar, the Romans. But in the future, they will build the city and temple with cypress wood and gold. And so this new era in the millennium contrasts with Israel's past time of wrath and foreign oppression. So in verse 10, Yahweh struck Israel in wrath, but he will have mercy on her in grace. The nations were used by God as his instruments to discipline Israel. But now the nations are being used by God as instruments of construction, reconstruction, and grace. So notice how God uses the nations in his dealings with Israel. Verse 11, Zion's gates will never be shut in order for the nations to bring in their wealth. There will be so much wealth coming in that they won't be able to shut the gates. Think about the Olympics and how the nations march around the stadium, holding up their signs and flags. It's a very impressive sight. It's very fun to watch. But imagine such a procession coming into Zion to Jesus and laying down gifts before Yeshua constantly, day and night. I mean, that is going to be a sight to see. In verse 12, the nations that don't serve Israel will be destroyed. Wow. So this seems to correspond to the sheep and goats judgment of Matthew 25. Let's read that. Matthew 25, 31 to 33. This is Jesus talking. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, the millennial kingdom, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. That's a reference to the throne of David in Zion. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. So early on, or shortly after the tribulation, and after he defeats the Antichrist and his armies, there will be this judgment, this sheep and goats judgment. And it's a judgment of the nations. It's very, very clear in verse 32. The nations as nations, not individuals, not Gentiles as individuals, but the nations will be judged as nations. And they'll be judged on whether they were kind and helpful to Israel during those 7 years of tribulation. I think that's the right way to interpret what Jesus is saying in Matthew 25. And so the nations that didn't help Israel and that aren't willing to serve Zion and Jesus in the millennium will be wiped off the map. They will lose their status among the nations of the world. So maybe there's three categories of responses to Israel: positive, neutral, and negative, or I don't know. It's hard to say. Obviously, nations that are positive to Israel will be blessed and they'll be part of the millennial kingdom. But it seems to be that the goats are nations that will basically, because they've been so anti-Israel, probably for a long period of time, including in the tribulation, they'll just fall off the map, and they will be, in the words of verse 12 here, destroyed, or they will perish. They will be laid waste. And so we don't want our nation to be that. We don't want New Zealand to be one of those that are utterly laid waste. We want them to be pro-Messiah, pro-Yeshua. And so every nation has to decide how it's going to respond to Jesus. And again, especially in the tribulation, each nation will be tested on whether they're going to follow the anti-Messiah or the true Messiah. So interesting. Let me read this quote from John Oswalt. Humans have only two choices regarding God. We will serve him either voluntarily or involuntarily. The nations that recognize his lordship are invited into the fullest participation in his covenant. Those who do not recognize his lordship invite on themselves captivity and destruction. Thus here, if some kings minister voluntarily, verse 10, others will do so involuntarily. We must serve God through Zion one way or another, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Thus, service to God by the nations through Zion will occur gladly on the part of some, forcibly on the part of others. I just thought of something. Maybe it's that the nations who aren't willing to serve Zion or serve the remnant of Israel, they'll lose their nationhood, and then they will become servants to Israel and possibly others. So that could be a consequence. So maybe that's how it's going to be. We'll have to see how some of these details pan out, but we do know that the broad strokes are clear as we read this in a plain, literal, grammatical way. So in verse 13, we've got some construction materials. We've got wooden beams from Lebanon, and it's with these beams, cypress, plain pine, that the new city, and especially the temple, will be rebuilt. Remember, this is a temple, the Millennial temple, that has to be built with human hands. This echoes back to Solomon's temple, doesn't it? As if you'll recall in 1 Kings 5:10, Hiram supplied timber, cedar, and cypress wood to Solomon as much as he desired, 1 Kings 5:10. So Lebanon really does have the best building material in the ancient Near East, and it's still known for that. So just as Hiram provided building materials to Solomon, so in the millennium, the Lebanese will provide building materials for the construction of the millennial temple. Isaiah 29:17 and Isaiah 35:2 mention Lebanon in its relationship to the temple. Let me read Isaiah 35:2. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of Yahweh, the majesty of our God. So this is a very key part of the millennial rebuilding, is this Lebanese wood for the construction of the new temple. Again, we want to go back to Ezekiel 40-48 to get the dimensions and instructions for how to build this temple. And finally, I want to point out that Zion is the place of Yahweh's feet. And you see that there in that verse, the place of my feet, glorious. So Zion is the place where God touches down in our world. That's what makes it so special. Psalm 132:7, let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Isaiah 66:1, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Lamentations 2:1, how Yahweh in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. So there we see that Zion is the footstool of God. And but here is going to be a big change from that Lamentations verse, and that the place of Yahweh's feet is going to be glorious. So having been humbled, Israel's enemies will call Zion the city of Yahweh, the city of Yahweh, Zion of the Holy One of Israel. So this is a reversal of the past. In Isaiah 39:7, we read this: and some of your own sons who will come from you, Hezekiah, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and there shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So that's the cream of the crop of the Jewish people being taken away to serve a foreign king, Nebuchadnezzar. But here it's the sons of those who afflicted you shall come bending low to you. All who despised you shall bow down at your feet. This may sound cruel to our ears in the modern world, but for the ancient world, this was normal. And so this promise is appropriate. Israel has been forced to bow down at the feet of the nations for a long time because of God's discipline. But here, the nations who took advantage of that will now come and bow down at the feet of the remnant of Israel. So justice will be done. Zion is the city of the Holy One. God is in the midst of Zion. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. Psalm 46:5. Psalm 48:2. Beautiful in elevation is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. That's awesome. Psalm 48:2. Isaiah 48:2. For they call themselves after the holy city and stay themselves on the God of Israel. And Isaiah 52:1. Awake, awake, put on your strength, Zion, put on your beautiful garments, Jerusalem, the holy city, for there shall no more come into you the uncircumcised and the unclean. What will make Zion so glorious is the presence of God and the holiness of God. The Holy One of Israel will be there in this city where the nations are streaming towards. Okay, very, very good. Let's continue on. We've got 3 more paragraphs. Let's do one more paragraph, and then I'll stop this video and we'll go on to the next. So verses 15 to 16, majestic forever. Whereas you have been abandoned and hated with no one passing through, I will make you majestic forever, a joy from age to age. You shall suck the milk of nations, you shall nurse at the breast of kings, and you shall know that I, Yahweh, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. Zion has been hated throughout her history, but here Yahweh will make her majestic forever in verse 15. Israel and Jerusalem were attacked again and again by the foreign nations, Egyptians, Philistines, Edomites, Syrians, Ammonites, Moabites, Assyrians, Babylonians, the Romans, Greeks, Persians, especially the Romans in 70 AD. Hatred, but this hatred and this of the nations will turn to majesty and joy. Psalm 35, for his anger is but for a moment, but his grace is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Isaiah 26:19, you who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. And Isaiah 27:2, in that day, a pleasant vineyard, sing of it. A joy, Zion is going to be a joy from age to age. Zion 2 in verse 16 will, quote, suck the milk of nations, end quote, and realize Yahweh is her Savior. So this is a far cry from the anti-Semitism Israel has experienced throughout her history. It's going to be a massive change. Israel will be cared for and supported by the great nations of the earth. This echoes what Isaiah said previously in Isaiah 49:23. Kings shall be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground, they shall bow down to you and lick the dust of your feet. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame. So it's worth being part of the remnant of Israel. If you're a Jewish person listening, through faith in Yeshua, the Mashiach, you will get this treatment. You will be part of the remnant, and you will experience this great blessing and turnaround of the attitude of the nations towards you. All right, great. That's part 2 on Isaiah 60. Click on Isaiah 60 part 3, and we'll finish up this chapter. Thank you for being with us.